Well, welcome everybody to this Festival of Ideas event. It's really nice to see everyone here, of course. My name is Alicia Madalena. I'm an associate lecturer here at the University of York in medieval literature. And I am absolutely delighted to be chairing this event with Adrian Goldsworthy. So, as I said, it is my absolute pleasure to be introducing Adrian Goldsworthy. Adrian studied at the University of Oxford, where his doctoral thesis examined the Roman army. He went on to become an acclaimed historian of ancient civilizations, with numerous works of nonfiction, including The Eagle and the Lion, Philip and Alexander, Kings and Conquerors, Caesar, The Fall of the West, Pax Romana, and Hadrian's Wall. And of course, Adrian is here today to discuss his latest book, Athens and Sparta, the rivalry that shaped ancient Greece. So we're very excited to hear him talk to us today about these two Greek powers. And I will pass it over to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I had the choice today. They said you can either sit down in a chair and talk, or you can wander freely. Now, normally I like wandering freely, but I go everywhere. But today I brought my son up to York, and we've been doing all the tourist things, and we've been to the chocolate story this morning, and they've pumped us full of various things. So I thought, I'm going to sit down. I really can't cope with that. Anyway, let us go back to 5th century BC, which is the main focus of the book. Athens and Sparta, how they were at various times rivals, they were allies, they were enemies. This is a book of narrative history, and most of what I write these days tends to have a very strong narrative structure. That's not always fashionable in the academic world, where the tendency is to go for themes, for explorations of the underlying causes, the underlying trends, rather than the straightforward story. The problem with that is that unless you already know the straightforward story, you have no context for those themes, for those ideas, however important they might be. The story matters, but also at a very basic level, we live our lives in a chronological way. We don't live it by themes, by ideas. You know, we get up in the morning, we do things, and then another day comes along, and so on. So it's important, and it's also the best way of presenting history to as wide an audience as possible. And that's a good thing, because it's vital to remind people that history is about people, and people like us. Yes, they come from different societies, they have different attitudes about many things. You know, no one today would so readily accept slavery as many of the cultures of the ancient world. And yet in so many other respects, in their behavior, their emotions, they are very much like us. So the idea was to write a book about classical Greece. And the big moment that I think still survives in popular culture about this period is probably the Persian Wars. The invasion of Greece in 490 BC that led to the Battle of Marathon, that we remember now because of the race that has been inspired by it. We used to have a chocolate bar. Sorry, I've got chocolate on the brain this morning, but that's what happens when you go somewhere like that, that now we can't call that, and it's called Snickers these days, isn't it? But I'm still old enough to think of it as a marathon bar. Then in 480 BC, you had the second larger invasion under the great king Xerxes that led to the heroic last stand of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. It's one of those moments of history that everybody's heard about. In recent years, perhaps from the rather lurid film based on a comic, the movie 300, where you have lots of underpants-wearing muscular Spartans going around fighting orcs and doing all sorts of strange things, and a rhino and other peculiar things, although in a strange way it does follow the basic thread of Herodotus' description of this. And the Battle of Salamis, the great naval battle that was a Greek victory, Plataea that decided the war. It's very much a David and Goliath story. The Greek communities are the little guys. They are facing up against the great and only superpower of the age, Achaemenid Persia. And Achaemenid Persia was the largest empire that had ever existed in human history up until that point. Staggeringly successful, relatively new when they come into contact with the Greeks. Cyrus the Great, the founder, is the middle of the 6th century, the 550s. If we had better evidence for his career, we would probably readily rank him alongside Alexander the Great and others as one of the greatest conquerors and most successful military and political leaders of history. But we don't know very much about him, far less than we'd like to, as is so often the case with the ancient world. But in this case, the big empire loses. It doesn't get destroyed, because in the end it's fighting against a fringe people out there in the West that are, as far as it's concerned, semi-civilized and unimportant. Nevertheless, it suffers a reverse. It does not conquer Greece. It's a victory against the odds. It was the great moment, the finest hour almost, for the Greek communities that were involved in the struggle. And they celebrated it as such. The Athenians in particular, who liked talking about everything, and particularly talking about themselves, talked a lot about their role in this defeat of the great invasion. Even states like Thebes, that had been on the Persian side most of the time, were still quite keen on saying what a great moment it was. Macedonia is another case. They changed sides when the Persians had already been beaten and were retreating, but claimed to have been, their heart was really with the Greeks all the way through. Just that we happened to be fighting for Persia because we were part of their empire, and it's, everyone, little difference between friends, we can easily forget that. There is a contrast, and this is really the thread of the story in the book, why I look at this long 5th century. This is their golden moment, when Athens and Sparta, as allies, have stood side by side and been the most important players in the Greek resistance against Persia. And yet, barely a generation on, in 431, when Athens and Sparta go to war, both of them from the start thinking about, can we go to Persia and ask the great king for money to fund our warfare, our war against these other Greeks? So you've gone from finest hour, golden moment, heroism against the odds, to let's ask the Persians to pay us to go and defeat these other Greeks. So why write about classical Greece, 5th century Greece? In the popular imagination, the Romans get far more attention. Now, I'm a Romanist by training at heart. Most of what I've done has been about Roman history, and will continue to do so. A few years back, I wrote a book on, well, it was Philip II and Alexander the Great, his son, because I didn't want to do a book just on Alexander, who gets lots of attention all the time, but Philip is important. While I was doing that, I kept thinking, I'd like a really good introductory book, something accessible and up to date, that told us what the world was like, beginning of the 4th century BC, when Philip's born. And there isn't really one. There's lots of terrific studies on specific topics, on, say, Sparta, Spartan culture, on Athenian democracy, Athenian law, Athenian art, ideas, theatre, but an overall, a basic story, back to the narrative history we talk about. And it is one of those things, the Romans do get far more attention. Now, I'm not going to knock that because it's my living, but nevertheless, there was that strange thing that was doing the rounds of the news channels a year or two ago that so many men are supposed to spend so many hours a week thinking about the Roman Empire. Now, obviously I do, it's my job. And I'm weird enough to have been like that since I saw Spartacus and Ben-Hur on the TV as a kid, became interested, wanted to visit Roman sites, had that immediacy that if you live, obviously you've got it here in York on your doorstep, in South Wales where I come from, we had Caerleon, we had Caerwent, a Roman legionary fortress, a Roman city. You could go and climb over Roman history, which, as a badly behaved boy in those days, you would do. People are a bit stricter now and have more respect for national monuments. But the Romans get lots of attention. When you think we get lots of books about the Romans, far more on the documentary channels, you're far more likely to get a Roman-themed documentary than anything Greek. And it might be about Caesar, it might be about Caligula, it could be about Pompeii, it could be about the Roman army or gladiators flooding the Colosseum, all this stuff. It's there all the time. I've been in quite a lot of them. So, I know they keep getting churned out. Compare that to the amount of coverage of Greek history. And it's incredibly small, which is very odd. Sometimes, occasionally, you'll get something on the Spartans. You might occasionally get something on Alexander. If you think of the TV dramas, the movies, again, we keep coming back to the Romans. The Romans, again and again, Greeks very rarely. And it's things like 300, or it's things like the Oliver Stone Alexander film. There's not very much. And it's almost affected the way we think about the past, in that if you summed it up, people almost think of the Romans as the people who did things and the Greeks as the people who thought things. When we do talk about the Greeks, it tends to be very much about ideas and culture. It tends to be about remarkable architecture and art. It tends to be about comedy and drama that can still be funny or moving today. It's about philosophy, the people who are starting to try and analyze the natural world, the world around us, and analyze politics. who give us words like, and concepts like democracy. We tend to isolate the Greeks from the actual history of people doing things. And it becomes Greeks as almost a university and just the senior common room that are sitting there having these grand ideas, but are divorced from actually getting their hands dirty and doing anything. And this is misleading in so many ways. A, because there's an awful lot more people out there who are working and getting their hands dirty and growing things or making things and trading things to support somebody who's thinking. But also, the people we remember for their cultural contributions or their intellectual contributions did a lot of other stuff as well. If you think about Aeschylus, this is a man who supposedly composed his own epitaph and didn't talk about the plays he wrote, instead talked about the valor he showed at the Battle of Marathon, where he fought in the ranks and where his brother was mortally wounded. That's what mattered to him. Socrates served several times in battle and at war. Sophocles doesn't come across as terribly military at all, was an admiral of the Athenian fleet on more than one occasion, elected to that post, given charge of very responsible things. Let alone the dramatic stories that make up Greek history and the larger-than-life characters, the wily Themistocles, Alcibiades, a man who is crying out for some lurid HBO-style series. And this is the Athenian aristocrat of aristocrats who is the best-looking man of his generation, so he tells everybody, and so they're willing to believe it. But also very bright, very flamboyant, gets involved in a scandal, having been chosen to be one of the leaders of an army going off to attack Sicily for reasons best known to nobody really at the time, and then changes sides, goes off to Sparta, advises the Spartans on how to fight the Athenians, this is during the war, but has an affair with one of the Spartan kings. There are two Spartan kings, sorry, I better say this carefully, the wife of one of the Spartan kings. And so that later on, her son is barred from succeeding because it's claimed that he's actually Alcibiades' illegitimate child, and gets chased out of Sparta, or has to leave fairly hastily, because obviously the king is none too impressed by this, goes off to live with a Persian satrap, eventually has to leave there, goes back to Athens, is accepted, rehabilitated for a while, and then chucked out again, and eventually is killed when his house is burnt down by a group of raiders who come at night, and Plutarch, his biographer, says, well, what he thinks is that these were the brothers of a young woman that he'd basically mistreated. And so this is, if you want Game of Thrones type lurid, Alcibiades has it all. These are not dull stories. But let's try and think a little bit beyond this. There isn't the coverage. What I've tried to do in a book like this is tell the story, but also explain what we know, how we think we know it, and also, as importantly, what we don't know. There is very much about the ancient world that is not well recorded. Even some quite important events we cannot date precisely to 1 year because nobody tells us and there is no record. There are lots of other things where we're guessing. So it's important for the historian to be honest and say, this is what we know and this is what we don't know. There's also got to be a lot of warfare, a lot of politics in a book like this, because these are the dominant things that are talked about in the sources, but also the main theme of the story, the things that mattered. So there's a lot going on beyond the clever ideas, and you can understand the ideas and the culture as it develops if you have this context of what's happening politically as well. So very briefly, let's just say a few things about what I talk about in the book. Most important thing to remember, this is a history of Greeks before there is a Greece. The Persians do not invade Greece as a nation, as a country. Greeks recognize their shared culture, their language. Everybody seems to be able to understand everybody else, even though there are quite strong dialects. But there is no move at all towards unification, to the sense that we should be a country of Greece, that we should all come together. Instead, there is the polis, the city-state, the community of an urban center with the lands around it, some of them tiny, really, really tiny. Some of them can be 10 square miles in area. Some of them, like Athens and Sparta, are big. By about the early 4th century, there are over 1,000 Greek city-states. Now, not all of them are in Greece itself. You've obviously got all the islands, because if you look at a map of the Aegean, it's peppered with islands large and small. They have expanded to Sicily, to Italy, to Marseille in southern France, began as Massilia, a Greek colony, They're in Spain, they're in North Africa, they're around the Black Sea, the Crimea, all of this area, but nevertheless, the bulk of them are in central Greece, the Peloponnese. And most, well, not just most cities, every city will live with an independent rival and sometimes enemy within walking distance, and usually more than one of them. So Plataea, for instance, which plays an important role in the Peloponnesian War, before that was the only city to stand with the Athenians at the Battle of Marathon, is 8 miles away from its bitter enemy Thebes. 8 miles. You know, this is not far. You are dealing with a very concentrated world. Even where the distances are greater, often because of communication by sea, communication is much faster. So what's perhaps the one thing we remember today about the Greeks, even if you don't know anything about them, it's probably going to be the Olympic Games. That sense of competition, this is something that begins traditionally in the 8th century. Again, you had to be a Greek to compete in this. There is a marvelous story about an earlier Alexander, not an ancestor of Alexander the Great, who wanted to compete in one of the races at the Olympics, and the committee involved has a debate over whether a Macedonian counts as Greek or not. Because if you weren't Greek, doesn't matter who you are, how important you are, you're not really the thing and you can't take part. They eventually decide, based on the tradition, that the royal family of Macedonia was descended from exiles from the city of Argos, which is the great rival of Sparta and not far away from it, and therefore they were properly southern Greeks and that was all right. So he was allowed in. But they had to think about it. So they have a very clear sense of identity, and the whole fact that they coined the term barbarian for everyone who is not a Greek. The rest of the world, that no matter how well-behaved they might be, how clever they might be, aren't really the thing, because they're not Greek. But they also, for the Olympics, had to declare a truce, which in later periods lasted for a month, either side of them, so people could travel there without getting shanghaied, attacked by their neighbors. Wars were suspended for that period. So you do have cases where people who are going to resume the war with each other soon afterwards meet at the Olympic Games. But again, that's an emphasis on, yes, we recognize this common culture, we have the same gods, we have the same stories, we have epic poetry like Homer, these traditions, and much more that has been lost. Because remember, if you think of Homer's Iliad, it begins smack bang in the middle of the final year of a 10-year war against Troy. And at no point does Homer bother to tell you why all this is happening, or who these people are. Who the heck is Achilles, or Agamemnon, or Menelaus, or Paris, or Helen? He doesn't need to, because it's like, you put a Western movie on screen today. Everybody has a fair idea of who's who, the sort of characters, who the cavalry are, who the sheriff is, who the outlaws are. You're dealing with stories that are basically familiar. And everybody knew this. So they're part of a much bigger tradition of tales that is shared, with some variations, but broadly speaking, shared by everyone who considers himself to be Greek. So you have this competition that runs through every aspect of Greek society. It's there, obviously, in sporting cultural events like the Olympic Games. Remember, the Olympics is only one of several games that are on a cycle that go every 4 years. But within a city, people compete to be the most prominent man in the city, particularly aristocrats, perhaps even to the extreme of becoming tyrant and trying to control it. Individual cities compete with their neighbors. All the time, everyone is looking at the outside world and saying, where do we fit into the pecking order? And this has a very practical effect on your life, because your prestige determines how people treat you. So if you are considered to be a great, famous, and grand city, then people will not try to push you around, may not even attack you. If you are considered to be a city of little worth, little strength, you're not good at fighting, then they certainly will push you around. And if anybody is seen to be slipping from their status, then their neighbors, their rivals, all the people who have all sorts of generations-old grudges against you will start to exploit that situation. So there's a constant reassessment of where you stand. Prestige, status matters immensely for individuals, for cities. And there is a pattern that repeats itself of political revolution. Very few of these cities are stable internally. And they tend to go through a cycle of a tyranny where one man seizes supreme power, usually with some element of military force behind him, and suppresses anyone who's considered to be a challenger. The famous story of how do you control people? Well, it's like a cornfield. You cut off the highest ones, or the highest flowers, and you leave the ones that stand out as dangerous, kill them, get rid of them, or exile them, and you'll deter everybody else. Then you have, this will tend to turn into an aristocratic government where a group of wealthy, important people will dominate. And then eventually you might get this turning into a democracy where a wider section of the population, the demos, the people, begin to make things, but that might break down as a faction of them support one charismatic leader who becomes a tyrant, and so on and so on. Internal stability is incredibly rare in Greek cities. So let's look at the two cities, the focus of the book. First of all, the Spartans. They have a very distinct self-image story about themselves. As far as the Spartans are concerned, they are the conquerors, or at least the descendants of conquerors. They have moved to the Peloponnese, that's that big sort of peninsular island bit in the southwest of mainland Greece, joined to the rest by the Isthmus of Corinth. And they've come from further north. They were Dorian Greeks, a different group, led by their royal families, are the sons of Hercules, the descendants of Hercules. They came in and they seized by force the land they occupied. And then in later centuries, they crossed the mountains to the west, conquered Messenia as well. And they took the existing population and turned them into what they called helots. Effectively, it's a serf class. They are not quite slaves, but close enough where it's hard to see the distinction in certain respects. They seem to be considered part of the land, part and parcel of the land. So you are allocated farmland and you get the labor force of helots with it. A 7th century poet, one of the few Spartan poets, talks about these people toiling all their lives and having to give half of all they produce to their overlords, and then when that overlord happens to die, they've got to pretend to be sad that this person who's been exploiting them all their lives is now dead. They are treated extraordinarily badly. They are not given any rights whatsoever. And on top of this, you have the narrow top of a very high, wide pyramid, the Spartans themselves. The Spartans don't have to work because the helots do it for them. And they are allocated land so that if they don't already possess it as an aristocrat, that will support them. This then frees them to be a full-time citizen. Part of that is the famous bit, obviously movies like 300 do this, where it's about training your body physically and training for war, training to be an excellent fighter, both as an individual but also as a group. Part of it's also just training to be a good citizen. In one sense, you are almost living the ideal aristocratic life of the heroes of Homer, of an Odysseus, of an Achilles, that you justify by your heroism and your skill in warfare, by taking risks. But you don't have to work, you live off the fat of the land, and you also, I mean, the Spartans are slightly peculiar in that they keep a long hair is customary for Spartan adults, much, much longer, when the rest of Greece has gone to quite short hair. They grow beards, but to show that they're making an effort, they shave the moustache. So that it isn't just a sort of wild beard that doesn't require much maintenance. This is time-consuming. It's about emphasizing your appearance. Again, it comes back to this leisured element, but leisured within the context of you're always part of society, you are always with other Spartans who judge you from a young age, where you're communally educated, at least for some aspects. The big problem with understanding Sparta, which we can't go into great detail, but is worth remembering, is that whereas the Athenians chatter non-stop and write lots of things down, the Spartans don't. Sparta has to be understood by what other people said about it. And very often it's what other people said and wrote about it 400, 500 years after this period, in the Roman period. A lot comes from Plutarch. Now, he's a Greek, but he's also a Roman citizen, and he's writing in the early part of the 2nd century AD. So more than 500 years after the period I'm dealing with. And often he mentions things just once. So there has been a tendency in the past to take something said about the Spartans very rigidly, very precisely, and assume it's one piece of a jigsaw that all fits together. We can piece this on. So, for instance, we know about the communal education of Spartans, but as far as we can see, all Spartans are also literate, quite familiar with Homer, with a lot of the famous literature. Nobody tells us how they learned that, presumably because it's the same as other Greeks do it. So a lot of it's done in the family, in the household. But nobody tells us. What we get are the odd things the Spartans did, or are considered to have done, So that we're told, for instance, that Spartans, once they're over 30, they're now a full member of society. Spartan men belong to a messing group of maybe 20 others, or fewer, 15, 20, that sort of thing. And that every night of the year, unless there's a festival on or they're off hunting, they dine together, not with their families, but with these messmates. And then they have to walk home afterwards, and they're not allowed to use the light to find their way home. They've got to be able to stay sober enough to find their way back. And they pool the food resources that the mess eats. And many people interpret this literally and say, well, this means that everybody's got to be living within a very small area. Because if you all dine together and then you walk home afterwards, how far away can you be from Sparta? Problems with this, you come to the archaeological record, and we can't find the buildings that these messes are supposed to have, where they're supposed to have taken place, where they've been housed. Now, that's not surprising, really. We've only excavated parts of Sparta of this period. We don't know what these buildings would look like, so it's possible we found them and don't know what they are, or they're not there. But also you start to think, well, there's a whole lot. Sparta controls a huge area of territory. There's some of this never visited by a Spartan at all. Messenia, the big area they've conquered, there's no evidence at all for the Spartans maintaining a garrison there. And yet we know that at any opportunity they thought they could rebel, the Helots would. So what's going on? Are there garrisons that we're just not told about? Are more Spartans living there, so there's actually a community, and maybe they're just messing locally? Or is it, in the analogy I draw, it's rather like saying, as an example, somebody, when they were 19, went to York University and read history. And we might add they did it for 3 years or many years. We would know that that doesn't mean that for those 3 years, 365 days of the year, they are studying history and doing nothing else. We are going to know that, students do other stuff as well. Apart from the fact that term time is only a set period, so they might be going home, they might be going traveling, many will have jobs, shock, horror, maybe some of them have a social life or hobbies or sport. But we don't bother. All we'd say is that we tell somebody today, oh, yeah, my nephew's gone off to do history at York. We'd know what that means. When some of our ancient sources say the sort of things they say, like Spartans do this, they might be implying that, well, yeah, we know that they don't literally do this every day of the year. They just do it a lot more than any normal Greek would do in any other city, to a degree that's considered strange, unusual. The problem is we don't have all that background. We don't know what to assume. All we get is the basic text. So there's lots of problems about the Spartans. It is very clear they were extremely good at fighting. They do become the dominant military power of the Greek world, but they don't always win. And if you think about Argos, which is the great rival of Sparta before it started to allow you to order things in the shop and have them delivered to your house, it's not very far away from Sparta. The Spartans beat them quite a few times in battle, but they never conquer Argos. And other cities to the north, they make allies they do not absorb. So they're not quite so all-powerful as you might think. Let's come to Athens briefly. They are rather different. They tell different stories about themselves. The Athenians boast they are sprung from the soil. They are not the descendants of invaders. They are people who basically have always been the inhabitants of Attica, the lands around Athens. There's no real indication of there ever being a major rival urban center to Athens, which is a very large area. By Greek standards, it's a huge state. And yet there doesn't seem to be, even though the Greeks normally, split off into all these individual city-states, Attica seems to be centered around Athens from very early on. Its sense of identity is strong, but it also, because it's a big state, there are lots of aristocrats means lots of aristocrats competing with each other for power. Athens is very unstable for a long time. There are bids for tyranny. There is a successful tyranny established, we are told, on his third attempt by Pisistratus, maintained by his sons. This is eventually only deposed when a Spartan army intervenes for reasons of their own, nothing to do with Athenian politics. The Athenians have this romantic story of Harmodius and Aristogeiton, these two aristocratic lovers who assassinate one of the brothers who's become the tyrant after Pisistratus dies, one of his sons. But 4 years pass after that's happened before the tyrants are overthrown. It's one of those difficult things for Sparta to face up to the fact that for the Athenians to face up to the fact that we didn't actually throw out the tyrants. The Spartans that we don't like anymore, we're very jealous of, and we often hate and fight against, they did it for us. It's much easier to have a homegrown thing. I mean, you've got the 1776 commemorations in the United States at the moment. I think probably the most honest and balanced historians will say, well, without French aid, the War of Independence, the Revolutionary War would not have been won. But nevertheless, the natural stories, the ones you want to tell, the ones you want to pass on to your children, are of the homegrown revolutionaries, are of Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill and the like, Valley Forge. However, after the fall of the tyrants, something happens that the Spartans clearly did not intend, when a chap called Cleisthenes pretty much springs out of nowhere, although we know that he'd been a magistrate under the tyranny, and shapes the democratic system that will then rule Athens for over a century, and after a brief lull, be revived for another 100 years or so afterwards. This is the rule of the demos, the people mentioned, and it's, again, a difficult thing to trace how much of it is put in place in the first few months and how much is added over the generations to come. There are probably some changes. It is remarkable because it gives a vote to every Athenian citizen, or at least every Athenian citizen man. There's a whole debate as to whether or not women count as full citizens or not. There are something like 40,000, maybe 50,000 of them at any point, out of maybe 250,000 entire population of Attica. But even though they are divided into 4 classes on the basis of property, anyone can turn up to the assembly, anyone can vote, and their vote has equal value to that of everyone else. They can also, if they can attract the attention of those presiding over it, they can speak, they can propose a motion, somebody can actually vote. What's that? They can even do this wonderful thing called ostracism, whereby once a year it's decided whether to hold a vote on this or not, and then if sufficient votes are cast against one Athenian politician, he has to go into exile for 10 years before he can come back. He doesn't lose property, but he's just not allowed to be around the city. So it's a safety valve. It's basically, you've had aristocrats fighting each other for power for generations. Now you've got to the point where you think, well, if somebody's causing so much trouble, let's just get rid of him for a decade and see if things quieten down. And we have lots of these ostraca. The name comes from the little pottery sherds where the name would be written on. These would be cast and then counted. Very clearly, there was some organization in this, so there would be campaigns, because you can see some of them are in multiple ones that are in the same handwriting. So you've basically got a box waiting, I want you to get rid of so-and-so. Nearly always, basically any famous politician from the next few decades, there's an ostracon with his name on it. There are a few names we don't know about for any other reason. So whether that's just somebody who just really hated their neighbor and was just hoping for the best, that if I wrote this name down, he would go. You have, of course, the famous story. There's this chap called Aristides the Just, and he's supposed to be going towards the vote when this illiterate chap comes up and says, look, I'd like you to write a name on a pottery sherd for me. Could you write the name Aristides? And he says, well, why? Said, what have you got against him? The man says, I haven't got anything against him. I'm just so fed up of hearing him called Aristides the Just. So being the Just, he writes his own name on the thing, and promptly this vote was one of many. He gets ostracized. So you have all of this, but it did mean there's an immediacy to Athenian democracy that is utterly unlike any other system of any substantial state, in that the people can vote about anything, and what they decide, that's what happens. That becomes law, that becomes the decision. Even if they voted 180 degrees opposite the day before, they can change their mind and do that. And it is instantly enacted as far as possible. It's not like a modern state where there are institutions, not simply the 2 houses of parliament that has to consider things, but also then you have courts, you have bureaucracies that can mean that something is decided, but it can take years before it's actually enforced, if it's enforced at all. The Athenians can decide to do something, and that's it, straight away. That's what happens. The famous, perhaps the grimmest case is when, during the war with Sparta, the city of Mytilene on the island of Lesbos rebels against their alliance with Athens. The Athenians decide, the Athenian assembly meets, and the citizens of Athens cast their vote to execute every man in Mytilene and sell all the women and children as slaves. They have a think about this overnight, and then the next day they convene another debate the matter again, and decide as presented by the historian Thucydides, on entirely pragmatic, amoral grounds that actually, thinking about this, if we tell people that once they rebel, they're dead and their families are enslaved, they're going to fight to the bitter end. If we actually say that, okay, if you're a ringleader, you'll be killed, but everybody else, you'll be let off, then maybe they'll surrender sooner, which will mean we won't have to spend so long fighting against you. So on that basis, they decide by a fairly narrow margin to change the decision and only kill the ringleaders. They then send a warship off to get there, and fortunately it arrives not before the First Order, but before the First Order had actually been enacted. So the people are saved, they do suffer loss of property, they do suffer loss of status, but they're not all massacred. So you have, in a sense, democracy in an extreme, in that people can make up their minds, but they can also change them as well. And there are some quixotic decisions made by the Athenians. One interesting thing, we tend to think of this in terms of what's just, what's good for a political system. The historian Herodotus talks about this, and the key difference he sees in Athens before it was a democracy and afterwards is that before, Athens was not an important state for all its size, didn't do very well when it was waging war. Once it becomes a democracy, it gets good at fighting. He says something similar about Sparta, is that Sparta, because of its internal stability, because all the Spartans, the elite, knew that the Helots were there as a threat, they had to stick together, and that's the reason Sparta is stable, that's one of the reasons Sparta is so good at warfare. We've only got a few minutes left. We'll briefly say about the Persian Wars before we go on. One thing to remember about the famous moment of the Persian War, the last stand of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae, is there were other people there as well. There were Greeks from, there were Thespians, there are some Thebans, though some of those surrendered. There may have been some people from Mycenae as well. There are also, alongside the Spartans, a lot of poor old Helots who've been told they've got to go along to the battle as well, and who also stand there and die, fighting presumably as light infantry rather than the more heavily armored hoplites. So it's a little bit different, but also the big thing about Thermopylae, however heroic it was, and it clearly was a defeat. The Persian army marches through that pass, having outflanked it. Within a few weeks, the Persian army has burned down Athens. So from a point of view of the great king of Persia, you could actually say, I went to war to show Athens and Sparta they couldn't treat me with disdain because I am the great king of the greatest empire in the world. Well, I've killed one of the Spartan kings, Leonidas, his head's on a spike, the pass of Thermopylae, and I've burned Athens down. You know, if that's not proving a point, what more do I have to do? In fact, the war continues and turns sour. But again, sometimes we see this as a great victory, and it does pave the way for the later successes, but it is a defeat. Big thing I'll say finally, and I might have to rush and finish with this, because I think I'm supposed to finish at 15:15. Am I supposed to finish? Okay. One of the most interesting things the Athenians vote for as an assembly is in probably 483 BC. So 7 years after Marathon, barely 20 years after becoming a democracy, a chap called Themistocles, who's magistrate, votes to use the profits of, there's been a new strike in the silver mines that are communally owned by the people of Athens, nearby Laurium. And instead of sharing this out as a sort of shareholders' dividend, which seems to have been the practice before that, they decide to build a fleet of warships, these things called triremes, these oared warships. And they either build, depending on the source you read, 200, or they increase the fleet to 200. Now, when you fight the Battle of Salamis, and the 30-plus Greek allies that are left by this point muster their fleet together, highest modern estimate would put the total number of ships at 350. 200 of those are Athenian. The rest have come from 30 other states, more than 30 other states. This is building the biggest navy in the Greek world, and they do it incredibly quickly. It's expensive. Warships, military technology, military hardware is always expensive. The trireme is the state-of-the-art ship of its day. Athens has no particular tradition of building and maintaining these, because once you've built it, you've got to look after the thing. You've got to have shipyards, you've got to keep servicing it, you've got to keep the oars, the ropes, you've got to keep it in good order, you've got to clean the hull at regular intervals. Each of those warships requires, if fully crewed, 200 people on board. 30 to be on deck, 170 rowers. So you've packed an awful lot of people into a very small ship. And these are not Charlton Heston and his chums of Ben-Hur and the movie, this stereotype that ancient warships are rowed by chained slaves. That's not the case. The majority of your crews are Athenians. So if you just think, do some simple arithmetic, 200 warships, 200 people per crew, that's 40,000 men you need to crew this fleet that you've just voted to build. That's about all the adult male Athenians there are. Now, you do get resident foreigners. You do get some hired rowers as well. And you probably also get, there's an intriguing inscription that suggests earlier on in the war, you actually put crews of 100 rowers on board rather than the full 170. And it might be that the ships could still be effective in that way. It's still a huge commitment in terms of manpower. And this is, when the Athenians meet and they vote to go to war, they are voting for themselves to go to war, or their brothers, or their sons, or their cousins, or their neighbors. This is not some abstract, distant thing where you are sending the navy or the army off to do things. This means the citizens go off and fight. And this means there's a directness to it, but you're also committing not simply to building this fleet, but if this fleet is going to be any good, it needs to practice. Coordinating the stroke of 170 rowers is no particularly easy thing. And these ships are designed over time to become lighter, more maneuverable. It's all about the skill of the crew and the skill of the captain giving commands, the helmsman steering it. And the Athenians end up with an immense advantage, the sort of advantage that the Royal Navy has in Nelson's time over everybody else, because they spend a lot of time, effort, blood, sweat, toil, and tears to do this, because they are at sea nearly all the time. Even in years of peace, you are sending out squadrons of 50, 60 ships anyway to train for several months at sea, which creates this great pool of your citizens who are good at doing this. And you have to keep on doing this. Once you've got that commitment, it is permanent. So this is all connected with the creation of the alliance which will threaten Sparta. Essentially, in a very short time, Athens turns itself from previously fairly unimportant, if big, state into the greatest naval power in the Hellenic world, and then decides to stay that way. One of the roots for the return of rivalry and eventually warfare between Athens and Sparta is because how do you adapt to this world? It comes back to this whole question of status that we've had before, where you're looking around all the time and saying, well, where do I fit? Where does my city fit within this? How should I be treated? How should I behave? The Athenians suddenly push themselves to the front and demand a prime position. Their role in the war at the feet of Persia confirms that, and then the generations after, the decades after, are all really about everybody reassessing and settling this and working out where the balance should actually be. Success in Greece requires, just like the Olympic Games, it's not just enough to win. You need an audience to tell you you've won and say how great you are. And that affects international relations, diplomacy, warfare as well. So on that note, there's nothing like where I'd planned to be at this stage of the talk, but nevertheless, that's the problem trying to talk about a whole book. I'll finish there and we'll go over to questions. So.
Thank you so much. Oh, absolutely fascinating. I'm sure there's lots of questions. We've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. And I think the stewards have microphones, don't you? Fantastic. So if you just pop your hand up and we will grab you a microphone. Yes, just here at the front. Thank you so much.
Hello. Thank you very much for that excellent lecture. I've just recently finished a wonderful book by Tigerstedt, The Legend of Sparta, in 3 volumes. One interesting thing that he does is he refers to Herodotus and Thucydides and the extent to which they have a bias for or against Athens and Sparta. I just wondered if you reached any conclusions yourself about those famous historians and whether or not they have a bias against or for Athens and Sparta.
It's something historians have been trying to do for a couple of centuries, is trying to second guess them and say, well, what can we believe? The problem with this, when you start to think, well, what's the author really thinking? You inevitably bring a lot of yourself to it. It's better to take on face value what they are and then say, we don't have to believe this. I don't think it's simple. I think at times they are critical and favorable towards both of them. Thucydides is also, is obviously bitter. This is a man that is an Athenian commander early on in the war, and then when he fails to protect the city of Amphipolis, captured by a Spartan-led army, he's exiled. So this is why he's writing the history that he never gets to finish. He dies before, he probably lives to see the end of the war, but he dies beyond that. The other thing is, I would say, this is perhaps terribly vain, putting myself in the same category, but compared to a lot of historians, because of the career I've followed, I've written a lot. And I can read things I wrote 10 years ago, and it could have been written by anybody. I don't remember it. It's the same as the textual tradition that requires and says, well, if somebody's using a particular expression, a particular verb, word formation, that means we can show this is a different strand. He's taken that from one source. That, to my mind, is complete horse manure. You do things, you will often have familiar ways of doing things for a week or so, but it is not as consistent as that. These are human beings, but the problem is, in most cases, for anything either of them says, we have nothing else to set against it. So if you decide, oh, he's just biased against the Spartans, doesn't like them, so that means we can ignore this, you tend to end up then saying what you want to say. It's better just to say he might well be biased against the Spartans, this is what he says, we don't know anything else, and admit that doubt. So my inclination is always to say we're just not sure. We don't know, we can't prove it.
Thank you. Yes, we have a hand up there.
Thank you very much for the talk. One of the themes, in a weird way, of your talk has been competition with the Olympic Games and such. And one of the things you mentioned towards the end was that with Athens' navy, it very quickly became a very big player in the world, and Sparta had been predominantly a land army, and then it culminates in the Peloponnesian War. And to what extent do you think the Peloponnesian War and the way that it turned out with new warfare and such was because Athens was naval and Spartan was land? They couldn't find a way to compare against each other.
The thing is, because it's the one Thucydides focuses on, we focus on the Peloponnesian War of 431 onwards. But you could say that's really the third war they've fought. Since the 450s, you've had the Battle of Tanagra early on, when this, in fact, is, interestingly, the only time an Athenian hoplite army clashes with a Spartan hoplite army in a battle for which there are no sources at all, other than that the Spartans won. There's a few hints. It may have taken 2 days. We tend to assume hoplite battles are always hoplite battles. They're always basically the same. Maybe, maybe not. We don't know. They have fought. They have tried the contesting things on land, the traditional way, because there's immense prestige associated with that, perhaps more than there is to fighting at sea, because this is the old way of doing it. This is very Homeric. That's how they can present it. I think it's particularly relevant when you come to 431, and they both go to war remarkably readily, as Greek states tend to. It's something that, when people draw modern parallels about strategy, in the ancient world, you can go to war almost on a whim, and nobody's too bothered about that, because you feel you're likely to be successful. When the two sides go to war, they've not really got a plan to defeat the other. The Spartans march into Attica every year, kick down a few fences, chop down a few trees, want the Athenians to come out and challenge them, or say, if you don't come out, well, that shows you're weak, you're humiliated, you should give in. The Athenians, however, are saying, well, we're not coming out, we can bring in food by water, and we've got our fleet, we'll go and raid your coastlines. The Periclean strategy, Pericles is the great statesman of Athens at this time, takes into the war. He doesn't have a strategy for winning. It's all about not losing. If we don't face the Spartans in battle, we can't lose. So eventually, we've got more money than they have, we've got more ships than they have, we'll win. But again, that requires the Spartans to give in. So it's a slightly odd strategy on both sides. And the Spartans, once they've found the Athenians won't come out and play in the open, and then after a few years, they haven't given in. They've even have a plague raging in Athens, and they still don't give in. So the war is one of those things they rush into, and then nobody really knows what's going to happen, in part because they have got so big, and each side brings so many allies that there hasn't really been a war like this before in the Greek world. So nobody quite knows what the sort of playbook is. How's it going to be sorted out? So it changes on these odd events, like the capture of 190-odd Spartans on Sphacteria in 426. And then the Spartans get very cautious. Just that small number of Spartans presents a problem when they're prisoners in Athens. You don't want them to stop invading Attica. interestingly enough, again, they has another problem. When they finally do settle on a peace terms for a while, and those people go home, the Spartans don't know how to treat 192 men who've surrendered and who haven't done the 300 at Thermopylae bit. They have this tradition, we're told before, where you treat people as the tremblers. Someone who's failed in battle he doesn't lose his citizen rights, but he's disrespected, he is insulted, he's not allowed to join in, do all of these things. He's publicly humiliated. His life is made to be a misery. But can you really do that to 192 people when your total citizen body is only a few thousand by now, and when some of these people are really aristocratic? They're very well connected. So the whole thing, the war is something that nobody has any idea of how this is going to play out. So yes, I think there's that element. It's sea power against naval power, and neither can... But eventually, of course, the Spartans win by getting Persian money, and they build fleets to defeat Athens. But those fleets are commanded by Spartans, but the Spartans don't serve in them. So it's effectively a mercenary and allied fleet, but you keep on building, and eventually you win the war.
Oh, if you just wait for the microphone, and then...
When I'm invited on to Desert Island Discs, I always think the book I would take will be the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides. Because to me, in my ignorance, I thought that was a book about all history. It just contains so many concepts that we still use, like the balance of power and might is right, so many different things that I think are relevant today. But I think you just told me that that's a bit of a silly choice.
Well, not quite. I mean, it's what Thucydides told us his book was going to be. This was a book for the ages. I'm not writing... Because, again, it's a sign of this competition being so important. Most of the great cultural achievements, the plays that will still be performed sometimes today, they were first performed as part of a competition, as part of a festival to win a prize. And that was important, being first. Again, the recognition. Thucydides claims, I'm not writing for that. I am writing for the ages because... people being what they are, these things will happen again. Broadly speaking, he's right. You can understand, it's why the international relations people, the strategic studies people will still read Thucydides. You just can't impose it too rigidly on the modern world because some things have changed. A lot of Thucydides makes more sense if you understand how an ancient fleet works, how an army of the time works. He doesn't bother to tell you these things because he just assumes everybody knows. Or he gives you, there's it's a fascinating thing, sorry, this is a digression, but it just is a useful reminder of the sort of sources we're dealing with. He gives an account of hoplite army fighting in battle, and he says that armies like that, where you're all in a tight phalanx, you tend to drift to the right, because you've got your shield on your left arm, your right arm feels a bit exposed and vulnerable, so you shuffle a bit to try and get under the side of the man's shield next to you, and therefore everybody doing this means the whole army moves rightward. You read any book now about hoplite warfare, Greek warfare, this is a big theme. This is just assumed. That, mentioned by Thucydides, that's it. That is the only evidence for this phenomenon we have, and yet he's probably right, it makes sense, but it's a reminder that we've got to try and understand the practicalities of what he was talking about as well, and the human element. But there is a lot. It is... You are always impressed when you come and read Thucydides, even when you've read him lots of times before, at the approach, the attempt to be methodical, scientific, more modern as we would understand it. You don't get all the oracles and the dreams and the stuff that you have in Herodotus, which are great fun, but you have to have your doubts about. So I'd still keep it on your desert island. It's a good read.
Please.
My question relates to that as just what actually do we mean by a hoplite army?
Ah, right. Well, I have to give the exceptionally short answer. The long answer will be coming. It's partly in this book. It's also my next book. It's going to be on ancient warfare, so it'll be a theme in that as well. Hoplite, it is a Greek word, but the name, as is so often the case, we imply something rather more rigid than... hoplon was one of the words for the big round shield, and that Greeks carry. The idea is your hoplite is a man of some property, probably a farmer in many cases, who can afford a shield, a helmet, because your head's the first thing that's exposed above the top of your shield. If he can afford it, body armor, cuirass, perhaps of bronze, later on of leather, other fabrics, linen, maybe greaves, again, lower legs below the knees, because that's the bit your shield isn't protecting as well, who stands close together. Again, there's a big debate and remarkably militant debate about many aspects of this. A phalanx is actually, again, something we've come to say is this very specific Greek thing where you're packed 3-foot frontage, 8 ranks deep, hundreds of you, perhaps thousands, even tens of thousands of you, and you're one solid block that steams forward against another solid block. In some cases, people argue physically push against the other side, but you also fight as well. The pushing thing is yet another debate that is very acrimonious. And then eventually one side collapses, some of them get slaughtered, they turn their backs and run away, and then everybody collapses down in a heap exhausted because this is happening in the summer in Greece. It's damned hot with all this equipment on you, and you don't have any cavalry, you don't really have any light troops, you don't have a reserve, everybody's fought in the one line. The problem is, again, many of these assumptions have come from modern scholars looking at this and trying to say, well, the Greeks are doing something unique, something that is just unlike warfare elsewhere. Julius Caesar talks about fighting a phalanx of Gauls and Germans in the first book of the Gallic Wars. So the word itself gets used for just army or formed troops or mass of troops. We turn it into something different and say it's this solid block. I think the important thing is that at least in this period, the majority of these people are citizen soldiers. They are fighting because of they have voting rights. It's why women don't have a vote in any Greek state, because political participation is tied with your willingness to fight and, if necessary, die for the state. So it is a very male thing, and it tends to favor the better off who can afford better equipment. And in the old days, the sort of society that Homer reflects, you have your aristocratic heroes, the basileus, the princes, that eat the best because they do the most dangerous things and they are the most skillful when it comes to battle. They fight in front, therefore they deserve to live in peacetime. You know, you have the famous case in the Iliad where a chap called Thersites, the ugliest man in the Greek army, dares to criticize Agamemnon, and Odysseus beats him with a stick and tells him to shut up because, you know, you haven't earned the right to say things like this. And everybody approves this. It extends to a wider group of the population. Your hoplites are not your aristocrats. In fact, the significant thing is that your aristocrats who might in the past have fought on horseback now fight on foot as part of the phalanx with their fellow citizens. But you are probably never the majority, even of the citizens of a state, because you need enough property to be able to afford this equipment. You do get cases, it's one of the reasons Athens is different, and one of the reasons the Athenians extend democratic rights to everybody, is that when you have a fleet, you need an awful lot of rowers, and then your poorer people don't need the equipment. They can go off and serve and get a wage as a rower. And it's the fleets that winning you the wars and the battles. So hence the fact that the lowest of the four classes gets more and more political rights and status. But it is, essentially think of them as heavy infantrymen who are fighting fairly close together, who do want to go, you talk about going toe-to-toe, shield-to-shield, crest-to-crest, this sort of thing. Close-in fighting that is pretty dangerous, even for the winning side. The winning side probably loses, on average, not based on too much of a big statistical sample, suffers about 5% casualties. The losers, anything from 20 to 30 to more when they run away. However, that 5% for the victors is going to be overwhelmingly concentrated in your front or second ranks. So the promachoi, it's this word, the front fighters, a word that goes back to the Iliad, that was the heroes. People still celebrate themselves as fighting as a hoplite, as a promachos, as one of the promachoi, the man who's in front, the man who's in the front rank, the man who will also, there's a famous story where Epaminondas, who defeats the Spartans in the 4th century, they're in this very hard fight, the battle's been going on for a long time, and he asks his men for one more step. Go forward one more time, close again. When you're exhausted, when you're tired, keep fighting and they will break. And in fact, they do, though he will eventually get killed in his second victory. So that's the very, very short answer. The long answer is book length, possibly multi-volume, because more than any other aspect of ancient warfare, hoplite warfare and phalanxes is the most lengthily debated and most hotly debated topic.
Thank you so much. And we are going to have to call it there just for time. I'm sure, not to offer this on your behalf, but I'm sure Adrian would be happy to answer questions. We do, of course, have his book available outside from Fox Lane Publishers, and Adrian has very kindly offered to sign copies, bless you, to sign copies just out in the lobby there. So if you'll join me, please, in thanking Adrian one more time, and thank you all for coming.